This video will be about 10 major differences between the North and the South before the Civil War. After this video is over, I will be handing out a quiz with 5 different questions, and the goal for you is to get 4 out of 5 of them correct. So without further ado, here are the 10 differences.
The first one is population. The North's was simply much greater. Right before the Civil War, the 1860 census estimated that there was about 21 million people living in the northern states, compared to just 9 million people living in the South. And of those 9 million, around 3,500,000 were slaves. Because of this population disparity, the South began to feel like it was losing political power in the years leading up to the war. Number 2 is the economy. The North's was much stronger as a result of greater industrialization. Industrialization was the idea of manufacturing technology and building, which the North did at a much faster rate than the South. The North's economy was based on free labor, whereas the South's was based on slavery, which we'll certainly talk more about later. But in any case, Northerners at the time were emphasizing how the South was harming Northern industry and democratic values. Number 3 is urbanization. The South was much more agrarian than the North. They were mostly rural, small towns that relied on agriculture. Put simply, most of the big cities in the US before the Civil War were in the North, like New York City, Boston, and Philadelphia. Part of the consequence of having a larger population was simply that the North had much bigger cities and population density than the South did. As a result, the pace at which northern cities grew drew some fear and anger from those in the South. Number 4 is education. The North had a much greater emphasis on universal education. In the South, students from elite families could get educated at prestigious universities, but for the most part, universal education was really only a concept in the North. Educational reforms in New England states guaranteed a basic education for every student, with reformers like Horace Mann being at the forefront of this. This helps explain the North's much higher literacy rate than the South before the war. Number 5 is culture. The North and South were both culturally different in terms of where they came from and what their religious beliefs were. The North still very much had many of the Puritan values that emphasized hard work and a strict adherence to religious faith. Free Southerners, meanwhile, had more of an easygoing lifestyle known as the Cavalier spirit. The people of the North came more from an English background, whereas Free Southerners came from more of a Scots-Irish background. So yes, they mostly spoke the same language in English and were usually Christians regardless of which side they were on. But this Puritan versus Cavalier cultural divide was still very important. Number 6, size of government. This is one of those divisions that goes back to the founding of the United States between the Federalist Party and Democratic Republican Party. The Federalists argued for a strong national government while the Democratic Republicans emphasized states' rights. You still see this divide in some form today, with Republicans generally emphasizing a smaller government. But back in 1860, the newly formed Republican Party was actually emphasizing a larger role for federal government as compared to Democrats. Southern Democrats emphasized states' rights, including the right to own slaves. Again, we will address this more in depth later. Number 7, military. One of the advantages the South had leading into the Civil War was that they were inherently a more militaristic culture. As I read from another class, the South proportionally had far more men in military professions as compared to the North. In fact, arguably the war's most famous general, Robert E. Lee, was offered to be a commanding general by Abraham Lincoln, but he turned down the offer, staying loyal to his state of Virginia. In any case, the South emphasized the military more. Number 8, expansion. Through the Mexican-American War and the new statehood of areas like California, the debate over whether these new states should become slave or free raged on, and generally it was Southerners who were more in favor of expansion than Northerners. Southerners wanted to use expansion as a tool to build upon their slaveholding empire and keep their political power strong. And when states such as Kansas and Nebraska joined the Union, the Republican Party formed in order to fiercely oppose the expansion of slavery into new territories. Number 9, climate. As you might be able to guess, it was hotter in the South than it was in the North. As a result, slavery was not just seen as immoral by many Northerners, but simply impractical. An agrarian economy was not feasible in states with colder weather. That's really why most northern states had banned slavery by the early 1800s. But speaking of slavery, let's dive into the most important issue head on. So our final reason, number 10, is slavery. Many of the issues I have already talked about connect back to this one. At the end of the day, the South was for slavery and the North was largely against it. Now, before the war, most people in the North were anti-slavery, but also most of them were still not necessarily in favor of political rights for blacks. But those who were strictly anti-slavery and for black equality were known as abolitionists, and they made a significant impact before the war. People such as John Brown were seen as radicals before the war for attacking slave owners, but they did so because they saw the institution of slavery as truly immoral. Meanwhile, Southerners would eventually split off from the Union, with protecting slavery being the main reason they did so. As Alexander Stephens, the future vice president of the Confederacy, would say, the main difference for the South was based on what they believed was a fundamental truth, that whites and blacks were not equals.